Hello, everyone. My name is Alexander Blankeev. I'm an associate professor and co-chair of Ukrainian culture and ethnography at the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies, Faculty of Arts, and the director of Kule Folklore Centre at the University of Alberta. Both the Kule Folklore Centre and the University of Alberta are located on Treaty 6 territory, the land of many indigenous people, the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of all of those people. The Kule Folklore Centre is a leading research institution dedicated to study of Ukrainian folklore, culture, traditions, and the everyday manifestations of culture. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the Kule Events series. And today's occasion is a discussion of the book It Takes Three to Tango, the true story of fictitious romance in the correspondence of Ivan Ostafiichuk and Natalka Husar. The book is published by the Ukrainian publisher Rodovid in Ukraine. So in 1969, young, impressionable, and eager to master the world girl, a daughter of Ukrainian displaced persons living at the time in the United States, 18-year-old Natalka ventures on her first trip to Europe. She wanted to see the world, see arts and famous masterpieces of world-class museums of Europe, as she aspires to become an artist herself. Natalka Husar also goes to Ukraine, but Soviet Ukraine. That is where she meets many exciting Ukrainian intellectuals. Through acquaintances, she also meets Ivan, a dashing, successful, and very attractive man, I think so, yeah? We can only wonder what these two young people felt on their first encounter. But with encouragement of caring friends, they ended up setting up for a year-long personal correspondence that was also deliberately designed for the third eyes. As the encounter was set at the height of the Cold War, in the times of extensive Soviet surveillance, the two embarked on a highly intricate and intriguing journey towards each other. Their job was to pretend to be lovers, to write convincingly, so the Soviet Security Service, the infamous KGB, would believe their romance and, with fingers crossed, would allow them to marry, as Ivan wanted to escape the stiffened word of the Soviet regime. What was it like to write each other across the oceans in times of extensive Soviet surveillance of personal letters? What was it like to maintain these Ukrainian artistic connections across many years? Were the artists' emotions expressed in letters all but pretense? Did they meet? When? Did they marry? Did Ivan leave Ukraine? And if yes, when? In what circumstances? Today, we hope to find out, because the questions to all of these answers, because we have today with us Natalka Husar. Natalka Husar is a Canadian painter based in Toronto, the child of Ukrainian immigrants. She has long explored themes of identity, displacement, and cultural memory. Her work often examines the paradoxes of the immigrant experience, weaving together history, fiction, and personal narrative. Husar is best known for series such as Blonde with Dark Roots, where she stages imagined scenes of post-Soviet and immigrant lives, often against theatrical background and layered with symbolism. Her painting combine intimacy and satire, addressing longing, exile, and the search for belonging. Her work is represented in major collections, including the National Gallery of Canada and also the Art Gallery of Alberta. Actually, we have the painting also here. So, where her painting, Edelweiss Paradise, is currently on display. Actually, that painting was created 30 years after the letters were written, and about 30 years before this book was published. The painting floats somewhere in the middle, between youth and the old age. Like It Takes Three to Tango book, it weaves together many interconnected themes, history and fiction intertwined, characters craving for a better life, and the paradoxes of migration and also memory. In this way, the painting and the book, they speak to each other. But also, we have other Natalka with us. Dr. Natalia Khanenko-Friesen. Dr. Natalia Khanenko-Friesen is a professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies. Natalia also is the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta and holds the Huculak Chair of Ukrainian Culture and Ethnography at the Kule Folklore Centre, a cultural anthropologist by training and a long-term practitioner of oral history. Natalia's research primarily focuses on diaspora studies, Ukrainian-Canadian culture, contemporary Ukraine, testimony studies, and the impacts of Russia's war against Ukraine. She has initiated and led many documentary projects focusing on Ukrainians in Ukraine and around the world, including current ongoing projects Making Home in Times of Peace and War, Ukrainian Displaced Person in Canada post-2022, Witnessing the War in Ukraine Summer Institute, Undoing the Language of the KGB Files, and many others. Dr. Khanenko-Friesen is a recognized expert in early history of Eastern Europe and the author of many publications, including the monograph Ukrainian Otherland, Diaspora, Homeland, and Folk Imagination in the 20th Century, and also a book Ethnicity in Action, Ukrainian-Canadian Culture at the Turn of the Century. Throughout her academic career, Dr. Khanenko-Friesen has been collecting and studying personal letters that were exchanged between Ukrainians in Canada and their families in old country in Europe, particularly in Ukraine. And unfortunately, we do not have Dr. Andriy Kohut with us, but I think we will be able actually also to answer those really difficult questions about KGB. And I will start with my first question also, and it will be for Natalka. Natalka and Natalia, so that's how we will actually handle this situation today. So what was it like for you to venture to Ukraine for the first time? What was it like to meet Ivan for the first time? Did you hear of him before? What intrigued you about him?
Well, I didn't venture to go out to Ukraine. Right after high school, I went to Europe, like everybody would go to Europe. And I was going to see, Paris, London, Rome. And I went on my own. I was going to connect with other, like Ukrainians always have Ukrainian organizations that they can tap into, So in London, I met Ukrainians, and I ended up traveling with some girls that I met. And I was heading eventually to Munich because my mom had a girlfriend in Munich who had daughters my age, and I was going to spend the summer with them, like, camping, yodeling, or something like that. But I heard that there is an organized trip to Ukraine for students only. And I was like 17. I just turned 18, and I was dying to go. And at this time, 1969, Ukraine was still dangerous. And if I told my parents I wanted to go to Ukraine, no way. It was before phones. I had to go to Western Union, and I remember pleading, to send me money because I could go for 10 days to Ukraine. Anyway, 2 phone calls later, begrudgingly, I got the permission to go on this trip. I'm always impressionable, but it changed my mind, it changed everything for me, and I didn't even realize how it changed it for the next 30 years, actually. But on this trip, I met Ivan because I got contacts, and I heard that there was this artist, and I got to meet him. And he was cool. I also met my family there because family could come to the interest hotels to meet, foreign family. And my family was I couldn't relate to them because they were Soviet. They were so different. But here was this artist he was 29, and I was 17, and had a studio he was a graphic artist, and he was doing all these lithographs and etchings, and he was like fantastic. So we became fast friends, and we were going to be pen pals. And as soon as I got back to Canada, we started writing. It wasn't a romance. We were just, he was somebody I could relate to.
Do you remember his first letter, and do you remember your first letter?
Yes, he was a Hutzul, which is like from the mountains. And he had all these cool folk Hutzul sayings and traditions. And and of course in his studio, he offered me, I think, something to drink and told me a toast, like how Hutzuls toast, it's like 4 things to say, like, may you live with whoever you want, may you do whatever you want, like something like that. And when I got back to, and I was still living in New Jersey then, when I got back to the States, I wrote him that, send me that toast so I know what it is. And he wrote me, I knew as soon as you'd come home, you'd start drinking. And he wrote me that toast. So that's what I remember. And I remember also letters that used to come to my parents, to both my mother and father from family in Ukraine. They were always they were very formal. Well, not formal. Well, they were vague. And they were written on graph paper, I ended up doing images of that later. And they just spoke about things like we had cool weather and the crop wasn't good and Bohdan finished school. Like they were just, benign kind of letters, read between the lines letters. But Ivan would write me the way somebody would write, here. Like we had a common language, and that wasn't formal. And I could speak to him in my just, flippant, brazen, big mouth self. So I could relate to him.
Natalia, you have been researching personal letters exchanged between Ukrainians in Canada and their families and friends in Ukraine for a really long time. What was different between Natalka and Ivan's letters and those that you studied earlier, and taking into account that 1970s were complex times for both Ukrainians in the Soviet Union and also for those in diaspora?
Thank you for the question, but also thank you for the opportunity to be here with you tonight. Thank you for flying in, Natalka, so we can have this conversation. And if I could just start from afar and zoom in on those questions you brought up, just for everybody's sake, this is not the first time we're talking about this book. A month or 2 or 3 ago, in May and June, there were 2 more presentations held in Lviv National Museum. Rodovid Publishing Company had organized that. We got flown in, we arrived, we gathered, and we spoke about this, journey in letters, but also we spoke about that very journey in Ukraine, which is a fascinating experience altogether. It's wonderful to be back in Edmonton with this very story, which will turn out to be very different because we're in a different audience. Coming back to Alexander's question, probably I want to start with my own story. So this is an interesting journey in number 2. When I was working on my monograph, Ukrainian Otherlands, which was to reflect on how Ukrainians in Canada, specifically those outside of the institutional culture, outside of Kule Folklore, outside of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, somewhere on the prairies, living in their communities, working on their farms, how they have imagined and maintained the communication with their families overseas. And to me, it was also of interest to go to Ukraine or, those homelands and look into the same question, how those villagers, working in the 60s, 70s, 90s, whatever period of time, in their collective farms, in those small towns, how they were connected or disconnected from their families in Canada. And letters were the bridge. Letters were the vehicle where relationships flourished. Letters were the railway, if you wish, with those trains, or rather ships going across the ocean and sort of bringing news from one place, one continent to another over this big, vast body of water. Of course, also in folklore, if you remember folklore, and Bogdan Medvitsky's work in particular, imagined as, big waters, which you're daring to cross or you're afraid of crossing. So here I am working on this very important topic, looking into these so-called vernacular letters, how rural people in Canada and Ukraine stayed in touch using letters, thinking, what is it that I'm going to use for my cover of my book? And loving Natalka's art from the day one, from year one, when I've arrived in Canada in 1992, I thought, I'm going to go and explore what this amazing artist has done. Maybe she had letters. Lo and behold, she does spend a lot of time. Natalka, I'm using you in a third person. Natalka spent a lot of time in her art profiling letters. So that intrigued me more. We've connected. We've talked about your ceramic piece, which in fact ended up being on my cover. So in relationship to that very question, and you already addressed some of those dimensions of that, vernacular letter writing, which you pick up those letters, which you've again profiled so powerfully in your art, on paintings or in the ceramic renderings of that. These are, mundane, routine letters which might come, in Christmas time, around Christmas time, before Easter, maybe a couple of more times a year. I'm sure practically all of you have exchanged them, or you have them in your attics. And if you do, bring them to Kule Folklore Centre for us to house those, because we do have a building collection out there. From my angle, I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. When I was looking at these letters, I had this wonderful opportunity to read through those letters which were written in the 20s, in the 40s, in the 60s, and so on and so forth. So I've come to imagine the letters as being written in different periods of time and being formulated or being sort of serving very different purpose. Initially, when people have traveled and left their villages or towns and have arrived in Canada, settled here, the pioneer story, the pain of departure would be very profound. Leaving, families, wives, husbands, children, brothers, sisters. These letters, which were exchanged between the folks who have separated, were very, moving and not as yet ritualistic. So that phase would, last until a certain period of time, until, our new arrivees will settle in, will start, bearing their own children. They will start building their new identities, moving away from just being a brother to someone who is left behind in Ukraine, becoming an aunt, an uncle, a grandfather, and a big mother of a large family or grandmother of a large family. Professional identities would be woven on top of that. So your life will be rerouted in Canada. So that's when the letters would become more ritualistic. And that's, of course, something not to forget, this socialist totalitarian regime also playing its role in how much was hidden behind these very lines which you were talking about, one needed to read about. And then, of course, fast forward to the 70s, difficult times, 80s, and then the independence of Ukraine coming onto the political stage of the world. And letters continued to be written, but they were, in a way, rediscovered by, Generation 4 in these very, kinship lines, which I was very much interested in. So now, trying to answer the question Alexander posed, the letters which I was looking at, they were written between the families. And the whole purpose of those letters was to maintain, despite all the odds, despite all the repressions, collective farm, KGBs, to maintain that connection which was communicated oftentimes in bare minimum words, in bare minimum messages. And here I am trying to find that wonderful piece of art in Natalka's studio to use on my cover, and learning and becoming basically a person who knows you maybe better than some people. So I'd like to think that we've become friends. Hopefully you will agree with me. So yes, once at some point of time I got this to hear the story from you and then from the Rodovid publishers of that correspondence which you held, and you kept this, to you it was very important. And the letters which of course were exchanged between the powerhouse of Natalka Husar and the powerhouse of Ivan Ostafiichuk, those two powerful, artistic, I guess, voices, we can still use the word voices for the art, colliding in this letters world they've created for themselves. How could they ever compare them to, the letters Natalka was speaking about? We'll talk more about that. Thank you.
I wasn't an artist yet. I was just a kid. I wanted to be an artist. And how it started is the letters were really just pen pals. It wasn't until later, we corresponded for about 3 years, and we would exchange arts. I would send him art supplies, and he would send me graphic works, and I started doing graphics so that I could send them to him. Like, he was an artist, and I was so young that, just being in touch with an artist, like a real artist, was writing to me, and also he was a real Ukrainian. He wasn't like the Ukrainians that I was dating, So he was like the real thing from there. It was sincere fun, but then it changed. It wasn't always like love letters. It was just friendship letters. And it changed when somebody, a friend of my brother's, went to Ukraine and met him. And then in a very clandestine way, on a walk in the park, he said that he wanted to get out.
It actually leads to our next question also.
But also, if I can add to that, unless you want to say a few words, coming back to the second part of your question, which you reminded me of, 70s or late 60s. I think from what I remember, it was 69 when you landed in Ukraine, right, Natalka? Think of the 60s, right? That time of those cultural revolutions, one after the other, here outside of the Soviet Union. Think of all these new opportunities youth were facing. Many of you remember that maybe as someone who lived through those times as youth. So that is what the West was exploding into. Meanwhile, of course, we remember it as Cold War. And the Cold War, it's the round of it and yet another round of it. It's the 60s and the 70s. It's your James Bond movies, right? And so on and so forth. But for the Soviet Union, especially in Ukraine, the 70s, for the Socialist Republic of Ukraine, the 70s were yet another accelerated times of repression against the Ukrainian intelligentsia. And Ivan Ostafiichuk, being in Lviv, being part of that large intellectual milieu, not large, but very impactful intellectual milieu, was inevitably under the eyes and under the persecution, under the surveillance of the security services of the Soviet Union. So when Natalia myself thinks back of what Natalka was going through, if I could add that layer to your reflections, I don't see just only two artists coming into this amazing context, but I see the two worlds, two absolutely uniquely described, uniquely experienced worlds of freedom, worlds of being under the gaze of, totalitarian regime and its security services. The world of young person, Natalka, who, I'm sorry, I'm not used to talking about you in the third person, but I'm looking at you. Your world, you just mentioned that, right? You were to become an artist. You were just on this trajectory of figuring out yourself. And Ivan was already established, recognized. Those letters which are behind or above your head, Natalka, are also profiling some of those excerpts where he discusses his exhibits one after the other. He goes, to Minsk. He's commissioned to paint or to do some, carvings on the basis of, I guess, Russian folktales at some point. I remember reading that. Lots of amazing things are happening to him in the world of the Soviet Union. So that's the space, right? That's the two universes which are, explored in these letters. So they absolutely are amazing from even that angle as well.
Looking back at those years of writing to Ivan, were you hopeful that he would leave soon Ukraine, like the Soviet Ukraine? What was it like to be on that mission to fake romance so that Ivan could leave the Soviet Union? What was your mission actually in that whole endeavor? Because it lasted 10 years, so...
Well, if Ivan left, I'd be in deep trouble. Because I was dating another Ivan here. No, seriously. So really, I never thought it through. Why I agreed to do this romance is I wanted to help, and because I was raised that way. You want to help in any way you can, and if it's marrying somebody, it's not a big deal. Like I didn't think of it as a serious marriage. I mean, I'll marry him, and then I was told that I'll get out of it. It's just a formality. And because I liked him, I enjoyed writing to him. It was very easy to just flip from writing, "Dear Ivan, this is what I'm doing now, and I love to see your artwork," to "Beloved, darling, Ivan, this is what I'm doing now, and I want to see your artwork too." But we just changed, sort of the tone changed. We started playing, and I love to play, so I was the perfect candidate for something like this, because I live in a world that's kind of imaginary anyway. I didn't think of it as anything real. Mm-hmm. And if it really happened, I'd worry about it then. But at the time, I was actually enjoying it. I enjoyed these letters, and these letters, they weren't a few letters. There was like 580 letters. So it's a commitment, but it had nothing to do with real life. It was a fantasy life.
I found really fascinating in your interview with Natalia for the book that you mentioned that it was not only your mission, it was the mission of all Ukrainians here in Canada to help those Ukrainians in the Soviet Union, that you actually were obligated to do as far as possible to help those people. So what was actually the mission, not only your mission, but the mission of the community? Did you feel that actually you were fulfilling the mission of the community at that moment?
Well, that's a big question, and I mean, we all feel it. We feel it now. You always feel, I mean, I've been doing work about this for all those years, with this, guilt, for lack of another word, but it's this duty, or this, it tugs on all those heartstrings of what you can do to help, because you are so fortunate that you're living here. And you can, and even now, we're living here, we're talking here, and we don't have to go and hide in a shelter right now because there's nothing flying over us. So you always feel very lucky, guilty, I don't know what the exact word is. So of course you help, and I didn't think that marrying was such a big deal. Really. It seemed just a formal thing, okay, I'll marry. But more than anything, I enjoyed it. So it was fake, but it was real too, And that's the interesting thing about this whole project, is that it's fiction, but it's true. It's history, kind of, but it's a romance. But it's sort of, what's interesting, really interesting, is that this book you wouldn't know where to put it on the bookshelf, like in a bookstore. Like, is it a romance? Is it mail art? Like, is it an exchange of images? Is it a political, historical record of the times? It can't be pinned down, and anything that can't be pinned down is like art. It's fantastic. It's something that I want to be part of. So in that way, it was not a big sacrifice on my part. I loved every letter, every minute of it.
But did your family and your friends, they actually knew about what you were doing?
Not my male friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, well, my family, I actually, in the book, in the interview, Natalia asked me, like what my family thought. And when my father was dying, I went to ICU, like to the hospital, to see him, and I had just gotten a letter from Ivan, and he was almost going to come. Like all these papers were already Like it was getting close and serious, and I didn't know what to think, really. But I asked my father on his deathbed, like I asked him, what do you think? Do you think I should marry him when he comes? And my father said, I'm too weak to answer that question for you. And he died that night. So that was my last conversation with my father. Like this big, always asking, how to resolve my life.
Yeah, yeah. My next question is for Natalia, and as I mentioned that Natalia, you interviewed both Natalka and also Ivan, and after reading all those letters, what actually you can just like after that conversation, maybe you open up something about those letters and the relations between these two really talented individuals after having that conversations with Ivan and Natalka?
Well, this is a brilliant question because that is exactly the encounter with Ivan when I thought of the word or phrase, it takes three to tango. When Lidiia Lykhach and Natalka, Lidiia Lykhach, Rodovid publishing company, which is behind the book, had both of you approached me and wondered whether I can be part of this project. I said, yes, but you know what? I love interviewing people. I need to do my work, so I will find out how to tell this story from a particular angle, which would be interesting. And it didn't occur to me to what degree Ivan's life was affected by his, monthly visits to the KGB office, where a colonel who would work with him for a couple of years, just simply debriefing him for 6 hours straight of his previous months, and then next month comes and he goes again. It didn't occur to me until I met him and I sat down and we had the interview, or we conversed and talked about the book, the project, that the whole correspondence hinges on that very third leg so profoundly. And overall, it had started as the community project to help out the struggling artist who's been unable to breathe freedom because he is, we know Ivan Ostafiichuk is profoundly talented artist, but was working within the system's, pressures. That was a very sad interview to me because the gentleman was approaching his 80s. He is very successful, as you could read further in the book if you choose to buy it today. But his story of relating to Natalka and looking back at the letters, where it was not just emotionally loaded, so to speak, but it was not as easily told either. And in fact, until I started asking him about the surveillance part of his life, and that he actually had far more to say, and I've heard, those very powerful stories of trying to trick the KGB agents who he knew would come to his studio to search his books because, some poetry would be put up and the overall community of Ukrainian intellectuals would gather and they will meet in his studio here and there. And so he'd place some little tiny stretches of fabric, or somewhere he says spider webs, maybe it was a fictitious, this thread, right? And he would then come back from his trips, he traveled a lot, to see whether that was shifted or moved, and then he would know they were actually searching him. That's the turning point in the project. And then, of course, the word tango then somehow I thought it would be very appropriate just because, the expression, it takes two to tango. In this case, it takes more than two. So that's the story. We can talk about, Natalka can tell us later when the meeting, how you've met later, but yeah, I was moving to talk to him. It was a very different experience. But also it was a different experience if you had the chance to at least somehow catch a word or two from those letters. I also have encountered, while working on this project, two different individuals. We have, a 17-year-old young and driven powerhouse of that future, talented and well-known, internationally recognized artist, who is a feminist in the end, right? Who is driven to turn the upside down world around. That's the paintings I remember. The world upside down. That's Natalka Husar's paintings. Ukrainian world upside down. And then from Ivan's side, you would probably see more of that sort of a traditional male, there would be lovely diminutives used, Natalenka, moya zirochka, my little star, my little that, my little that. There was a major mismatch from the beginning, but of course, if you would put that, the correspondence was lasting until 78, and altogether 76, it had reversed because of, you can tell us later why. It's a few good years afterwards that we're sitting in this very lovely space, and we are working and discussing this book with a driven feminist artist of Natalka, who had done so much for Ukraine through her creative and very, can I say upside down art? I don't want to use adjectives you would like to use to describe yourself, so yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so we already brought like a third party into the story, KGB, and it is really clear what that third party could actually do to Ivan. But you were here in the world that we like still think that it is free. But when you actually realized, and you probably knew, that that correspondence was not just only with Ivan, that was correspondence also with the KGB. So how did it affect, actually, how you wrote those letters, what you wrote in those letters?
What Natalia said is so true. It was so much more difficult for him than it was for me. Because like all of us who have lived and who were born and raised and have grown up in a free world, you can't imagine what it's like not to be in that world. You can't imagine it. No matter what your imagination is, you can't imagine it. I hate to admit it, but I knew that it was like for him to get out, but I couldn't imagine what the KGB actually does and how they read it or what they want to know. I got into the play of it, I love the idea of being in love with somebody who's in jail. It's so good, So, and somebody who's an artist, so I could draw for him, he can draw for me, and I will blame it on my youth, that I was not aware. So it wasn't with like great premeditation that I'm writing this and I'm going to fool him, fool the KGB. I sort of, you want to love? Okay, we'll love, and we'll do this and this and this. And it was, we played. We played so much that when I got a letter from him that at the end that he can't come, I was brokenhearted, even though it was fake, like it was fiction. But I got invested into this play, and all of a sudden it's over. Like even though like I'd be worried if it actually did happen. But I guess I'm pleading ignorance in a collective sense, because I don't think that we really know. I can't imagine what it was like for him,
Mm-hmm. But do you remember your last letter?
From him or from me?
Yes, your personal letter.
Well, it's the one letter that's reproduced in the book, because when Natalia was asking him for my letters, he had this excuse that he had given them to somebody, and then when he moved, and they're lost. But he did have one letter, and that one letter I wrote, "I'm sorry I haven't written back so soon because we've had a mail strike." So there was always a postal strike. But then it was like, I understand, we'll still be friends and we can be in touch with art. And then I said, I hope you basically have a good life. But basically, he said he met somebody else, and I said how happy I am for you. And then at the same time, I said, I feel weird saying this. I feel weird wishing you and your new fiance a good life. So I was aware, like I was very honest, really, with him.
Interesting, yeah.
Honest in the play.
Probably it is actually what leads to my next question for Natalia, and this is about the poetics and metaphorical language of those letters. Yeah. So Natalia, because censorship, you need to be really inventive. How you put your feelings, how you put actually what you want to say, and the awareness that your letters will be probably read by someone else who is can actually done some damage to that person. That poetics of the language and etc. How would you describe that actually thing? How was it actually happening?
You know, it's a good question. I have to say that immediately I'm actually thinking of those so-called vernacular letters, which are or used to be exchanged between villagers and folks on the farms and in the communities, rural communities in Ukraine, not only rural communities here and there. I felt, to be honest, when I look back at Natalka's and Ivan's letters, and in this case we are talking about Ivan's letters, and when I compare Ivan's, writing, far more reserved were the rural letters I was working with because they had to hide a lot. And I think in this case, because there was a project, there was a performance, it's a performance of over the course of 10 years, 5 letters a year. Those two, open up their mail, there's no SMS, no internet, right? It's still old-fashioned. I don't know how you wrote your letters. Close down and you spend time one-on-one with this space of a piece of paper with this person who is far away. You haven't seen her or him for close to 10 years, and then you begin writing, and you write this fictitious, you create this fictitious world. Letters, in my other writing, I've been arguing the letter space, it's already a unique third space for people who correspond in an old-fashioned traditional way, because it's not necessarily, it's a shared space, but it's also distinctly above and beyond what Natalka was saying, real world here and there. And that was the same fictitious third space and then space of encounter in which he took off in terms of his fantasies. Ivan had a lot to discuss in terms of his art, in terms of his shows. We also recognize what has been written to Ivan by Natalka in these letters, because it's, almost like text messages. You can acknowledge what you say to each other, spaced out by, 3 months each or months each. I think he actually had crafted that very, it's very articulate. You would be very immersed in his own poetic writing. There are some letters which read like poetry. There's maybe even I included it here, where it begins with the line, I haven't heard from you for a while. And then he goes to describe how green is the grass out there, how beautiful is this butterfly who just came to life on my sill, but then suddenly died. And next scene, and then again, I haven't heard from you for a while. And then he goes on to describe the dust or the cup of tea or whatever it is in front of him, or piece of art he's working on. And then again, I haven't heard from you for a while. And it's all in a space of one. So it's very poetic. That is because Ivan is the powerhouse of an intellectual and very reflective person. He has chosen to maybe not ignore KGB. Actually, it's another interesting story how he had described to me this exchange with his colonel, where he'd come, once a month or once per 2 months, as he said to me. He'd go there, and then the KGB would cite Natalka's letters, right? So there's no need in hiding. So it was just, yeah, you're naked on the table in front of this third eye, right? Like, you can't dress yourself up. So I think he's chosen not to dress himself up and be honest as far as the performance, because there's a mission, there's a story, and of course there's a gorgeous Natalka out there, right? It's something that I think defied the surveillance altogether. I wanted also to step outside of the actual, narrative plane and sort of reflect on the context of these letters. As I've mentioned before, to me, the lettered space, that universe which the two have created, indeed have become that space of encounter of the two otherness. The two kinds of others. There's Ukrainian other on one side of Atlantic for one group of Ukrainians, and there's Ukrainian other on the other side of Atlantic for another group of Ukrainians. Unlike any other diasporic culture, ethnic culture, Ukrainians have been deprived of the opportunity to travel and visit for so long throughout the 20th century. So much was left to imagination, and letters were that place of imagination. So this writing which Ivan delivers, to me, is rooted in this very unique Ukrainian nostalgia, which in fact in English I have called Soom. And I love that, I love that writing of it, S-O-O-M, just beautiful rendition of that word in English, right? So it didn't land that intriguingly in Ukrainian because it was just Ukrainian word. But that sort of a diasporic Soom, which is rooted in so many experiences on both sides of the Atlantic within the Ukrainian communities here and there, of course has something to do with the DP's experience, right? The post-World War II exile. Who am I to talk to this audience who had lived that, and who am I to talk to, having Natalka with us, whose mother and fathers had lived through this. But that whole post-World War II displaced persons experience was obviously a unique environment which had produced Natalka and many other powerful Ukrainian Canadians who we really are grateful for because they're part of our lives here. And just I wondered if I had a chance. In fact, I'm thinking of Natalka. You remember how when we had the presentation in Lviv and then we had the presentation in Kyiv Arsenal in Kyiv a week later, I remember reading the audience and understanding how much appreciation the folks who were in the room felt with respect to what you are as the representation of that displaced person's, milieu and experiences and history. Post-2022, so many have become displaced, right? 300,000 people have come to Canada. Many more millions are spread around the world, Europe predominantly, but also elsewhere. So that experience of living, of displacement, of being forced to flee the war is just so powerfully replicated right now, post-2022 in Ukraine. So it was, I was almost crying when we were talking about, because I've recognized how powerful you were to talk about your mother's, father's experiences while you were in Lviv, trying to avoid sirens, because if they would go, then we would have to shut the presentation down. So I think there's this circle, of trauma coming back again to Ukraine.
I only met him for 2 hours. And I wrote for 8 years. So, this whole experience with this book, because I kind of forgot about these letters until, once Lidiia Lykhach of Rodovid Publishing was visiting me, we were good friends, we are good friends. And when she saw these letters, she grabbed them and said, these are art, we have to publish these. But I sort of forgot about them. But now thinking about all this, everybody in Ukraine was saying this should be a movie because it's like perfect for a movie. And what's fascinating is that it talks about love, how we could fake it, and that's like how we can sort of convince ourselves that we love somebody or something and not really mean it, but kind of mean it, and kind of play that and walk that tightrope where it's sort of real and sort of not. And just that whole idea is so interesting, don't you think? Like it's above and beyond the fact that it's interesting about a record of the times and a record of different trends in art.
You mentioned that you had that correspondence with Ivan for 8 years, and then that correspondence stopped. But then, did you meet him? And when it was? And what was actually your feelings, his feelings? What was the meeting about? So do you remember that actual moment when you met him?
I met him not just now in Ukraine. I met him in '85. I met him after we stopped our correspondence. He actually eventually did marry somebody, and I don't know from where. Somehow he married, and he did get out. And he actually did come to Canada, and he came to Toronto. But by this time, I was already an artist, and by this time, I had a voice that was so different from his voice that I was not interested even in seeing his work. Pardon me, but we met. We met for a coffee near the art gallery, and we were estranged. It was like meeting somebody that you acted with, and you were Romeo and Juliet, and you met at a reunion 10 years later, and you were into something else.
Yeah.
And then now we met in Lviv. Well, it was wonderful, but it was on a different.
Yeah. So right now we know that he played his odes, that he also had another actually affair at that moment. But it is really interesting that the dynamics that you, as a representative of a community here in Canada and also in the US, in the West, had with that world, yeah, and that it was not your own mission, but the mission of the community. So, but this book right now that Rodovid has published, what does it mean for you at this moment? So what kind of actually message you think that book brings to the audience today, for instance, yeah?
The beauty of this book is that it doesn't have a mission. I think that's true. It can't be pinned down. It shows a time, it shows like a historical time, an emotional time. It shows the things we do as youth and how we play act and how we, I think if it has a mission, it's bigger than I could articulate it. So
Bigger than your life, probably, yeah.
which is the reason why the book was published and why it exists and why it has legs of its own. And actually, it has there's something else that happened, and I'll tell you, like, if we can later. But it has a life of its own. So it's not on a mission. I don't hate the word mission, because I don't think it's an artwork, and artwork should not have a mission. It has its own life. I think it speaks the truth in a poetic way.
Yeah. And
That's
right
what it
now,
does.
my last probably question for Natalia. So what is the future? Do we have any maybe like sequel or like to this book?
That's a good question. When we were working on this book, we were all very aware that the letters which are included in this beautiful art album are the ones written by Ivan. And as we were, trying to establish whether the other letters were preserved or not, I remember hearing Ivan saying, no, they're probably lost because I have left for, overseas. I gave it to a friend of mine when I've left, and I've never heard back about that. So the book is as it is. We are talking about the correspondence between Natalka and Ivan, but it only contains, the scholars' comments and the letters of Ivan. But that is the story that doesn't end. Natalka, what is the story?
When Ivan was asked what he did with the letters, he gave them to a sculptor friend, because sculptors have studios where you could store things. And this sculptor friend, who was his contemporary, so he was in his late 80s, just happened to have died like this year, like in February. And of course, they haven't been in touch because it was an old acquaintance. And he gave them to this, so who knows where they are. I half-heartedly sort of believed it. Yeah, sure, you pitched my letters, Okay, but get a load of this. At the launch in Lviv, there with Ivan came a doctor, like a friend of his who was a doctor. And we all went out for dinner afterwards, and he got very intrigued by this story, because he was also the doctor for this sculptor that recently died. So he said, I'm going to try to track these letters down, see what happened. So this is what I've heard, or this might be changed a little bit, but this is what I've heard. He went to his daughter, I think not his wife. He went to his daughter. He told him about this book, of these letters of Ivan, and there was letters, Natalka's letters that he had given to him like back in the 80s, like early 80s. And the daughter says, damn it, bad timing. I cleared out the studio. And there was so much stuff there, you wouldn't believe. There was so many, I had to bag and box like so much rubbish that the city wouldn't take it. You know, I had to hire a driver to come pick up all these bags of stuff, because you know sculptors, like molds and you know, and some friends' letters and personal effects. And he said, yeah, so, and this was a couple weeks ago. And the driver came and took all this stuff to the big dump that's outside of Lviv, like the biggest dump in Western Ukraine. It's even been in the news because there's been, you know, all this military drone garbage there. And it's, anyway, so, but this doctor decides to get in touch with this driver, finds this driver and tells him the story. And let's see, this was a couple of weeks ago, if we could go and find these letters, this garbage. So they go to this dump site, and he remembers where he, so on what end of this acreage he dropped these boxes off. And there's bulldozers there, you know, like to shred this stuff to pulp. And lo and behold, he recognizes a box. And there might be somewhere.
You would see this box with the
and
big.
he recognizes this box, and he opens this box, and in this box is this parcel that's wrapped up in lithography paper, and he tears it open, and there's a letter from me. So it's just, things like this do not happen in real life. You know, so it has a complete life of its own. So these letters were actually found. You know, they survived despite everything. So I think in some way it has to be an analogy for Ukraine. You know, I have to think of it in those terms. That it refuses to be eliminated.
And the irony goes further. I happened to be in Ukraine when these letters were found, and I was the person to track down together with Lidiia and make sure they're being brought from the village. And you know, here I am driving through Lviv to Kyiv, picking up those letters, bringing them in this very plastic bag.
By chance.
With the word scandal. And a big heart drawn over that, and then whatever store it was from. Incidentally, it comes from Ivan, packaged in this beautiful scandals plastic bag. And yes, you saw slides of Natalka's letters being opened for the first time. So I had this privilege of opening your letters together with the Rodovid's director Lidiia and taking pictures of this together. So it's, again, different kind of circle coming back.
Right now we are opening the floor for questions also, not only letters.
So you got to read your own letters. Did you remember them?
I have not read them. I haven't seen them. Lidiia Lykhach sent me a couple. They are embarrassingly naive. But like, there's one letter that I write that she sent me, and it's, I mean, I can't believe I wrote this. No, I won't tell you. Forget it. No, well, you know, like I said, 2 hours of meeting, you know, 8 years of writing. So you have to play. I draw him a rolling pin and a wooden spoon. I can't believe I said this. So like I'm very young. You know, don't beat me like that I haven't written to you. Like, oh no, I said, you can beat me for not writing to you, but not too hard because I'll run away. And then I draw myself running. So very childish, very playful, I think. You know what? Like the past can haunt you. Like if you keep things like as evidence, it can haunt you. But it's all very rich and emotionally rich and intellectually rich, and it makes you think.
There are some enlightened men out there in Canada and Europe. Naturally, men would like the superpower to peer into a woman's mind. What is she thinking? What does she want? So, my question is, if a man chooses to purchase this intriguing book of fiction, What themes can he hope to learn?
Well, if you want to lure a woman like me, you better start drawing.
My question is trying to unite your art and with this whole experience. Did you learn from one another, if technique and how you've evolved as an artist as compared to how he evolved as an artist?
It's a very good, poignant question. Well, initially, I started doing graphic work. I went to university right after I met him. That next September, I went to school and immediately signed up for graphic arts because I was going to be like him and I was going to do graphics. And then I could send them, and graphics are, not like paintings. You can just send it and still have it. But as your learning curve is very, from when you start studying art, from your first year in university till even those first 4 years, I very quickly started thinking that I want to do different kind of art, and I want to do art that doesn't have its hands tied, that I want to do art that I'm free so I can say anything I want. And art is this language that I could use. So I grew apart from what he was doing, and what he was doing was first of all, it was graphic arts, and it was a lot of illustration. And when I was studying art, illustration was like a dirty word. So I grew apart, I think, from that aesthetic, I'd say. And also, he did work in code, because he couldn't really say what he felt. So he had to do work in a kind of hidden way. And what I so much wanted, have been striving my entire creative life, is to not have barriers like that, and not to have to please anybody and answer to anybody. Like it is my sacred free pass. That's how I treat it.
Thank you very much, Natalka, for this wonderful story. I'm an archivist, so my question will be archival, archives related. First of all, a comment. So often what we find, the correspondence collections we find in archives are only those saved by a woman. So letters written by a man to a woman. Again and again, we find this situation happening, but that's just an observation. My question is more about how we in Western archival world, at least, think about archives as evidence, right? How we preserve our history, our memories. But what we find, those archival records we find in archival institutions are evidence of the truth, so to speak. And there is a growing understanding of multiplicity of truths, that these are just one version of a story. But in your case, if this book didn't exist and this correspondence collection was deposited to an archive, someone would have come and believed that this is the truth, this is the true story. And of course, on some levels, it is a true story, right? Even though it's fictional. But how important would it be for you to have this life story that you're sharing with us today also documented and preserved for the future? And I see the work of the Kule Folklore Centre, Bogdan Medvedski Ukrainian Folklore Archives in particular, as very important, capturing these stories in between, those that are told but never written, whispered maybe even, but they're not shared in official documents. So how important would it be for you that the future generation, someone in the future, some young girl, 17-year-old who is inspired by an artist, learns this story? And do you care if they know all the nuances?
Well, what's fascinating about these letters is that they're not written, they're drawn. So they're artworks, so they're different than other letters. Because we only knew each other a little bit, the desire to play was, what do you do when you don't know what to say? You doodle something, you draw it. So I think that they're very special that way. The fact that they're fictive and they're not, because we certainly liked each other enough, but not enough to marry. but enough to play. So I think they're unique. I'd be happy if they'd be in an archive. They should be, you know.
So in that case, are we going to see the second edition of the book soon with this edition and your reflections on your young life? Please say yes.
I don't know. But you know what's interesting about this book is that even though my letters aren't in it, they're in it in a kind of phantom way. And that's really neat. It adds yet another dimension. I don't know. Stay tuned.
When you received those letters, you said you were living in New Jersey. How did it happen? I mean, logistically, I couldn't understand. They were mailed to Toronto, but you would get them in New Jersey. My question is, what were your emotions? Since you said you liked each other, what were your emotions when you received the letter from him? Did you ask him the interpretation of his illustrations, or did you try to interpret them yourself? Because I saw like apples there and then like words going into the spiral. How did you like interpret them? Thank you.
Okay, just some geographical fact. I'm an American, Jersey-born, and I lived in New Jersey. And when I met him, I went from the States, and I went to school still in New Jersey until 1973. But we started corresponding in 1969. I moved to Canada in 1973. I took his letters with me. And though I'm not an archivist, I am a hoarder. I have a very obsessive, I would say now, relationship with paper. Like, I don't throw out, this is public shaming. I have every letter that anybody that I've loved has written me. I was just showing today at lunch, I have a Rubbermaid full of letters from, but these letters from Ivan, they were always so special that I kept them not in a shoebox, I kept them like a book. Like they were in plastic sleeves, and I kept everything, the envelopes. So they were basically a book. And I carried that book, I moved with that book to Canada. Yeah, exciting. It's great to get a letter. And the illustrations, well, we had to invent a language. He would draw me apples, and then, and I would say I made a compote out of those apples or something, or it was an exchange. Like I'd be fictively painting him Easter eggs, baking him malai, a cornbread, because he's a Huculak. And there's an illustration, I'm holding this, I baked this for you, and he would write, I can smell it. So it was a play, right?
So as I'm listening to your response in this conversation that's deeper than simply language, but it's visual and metaphorical, how did you not fall in love?
How did I not fall in love with him?
Yes. You put it in sleeves and you carried it as a book, but you keep saying it was a play. But when you write to somebody for 7 or 8 years, and there's a revealing that is not common in day-to-day relations, how is it you didn't fall in love?
Profound question. I have a heart of stone. What is the love? I mean, to this day, I'm a virgin with him. I've never kissed him, so it's like, it was a naive kind of platonic, I was in love with Ukraine. He represented something that I only heard about. So he was from there. So I was in love with that notion, I think. But as a real person, I mean, you say now we'd be mismatched. I mean, it's true. I mean, our art is so different. I'm lucky that I could fall in love on paper only, not that it wasn't really real, because it probably would have been I would have taken that rolling pin and, hit him.
Just very briefly, this is a fantastic question. I'm so happy it was asked, because when I was working on the text accompanying the book, I have written it very differently than it ended up being published, because I went on that idea of having them fall in love and then fall out of love as well. But the message in the book is different. So I just wanted to point out, and you said it in the very last line, you could coexist in two worlds and be in love in one and continue on dating in real world too, right?
We've heard your side of the story, this fictitious romance, and we understand it. But did you ever sense from his letters to you, his way of communicating with you through letters, did you ever sense he was falling in love with you?
Well, in this world where I was writing these letters, I was in love in this world. I wasn't faking it. I was, and you know, the letters, I saw a few of these letters, and those letters, like, are stamped with kisses. Like, I would, you know, put lipstick on and kiss these letters, and then I would write, do a heart and say Ivanko, because it's a diminutive of Ivan, and his Natalenka, like he would call me Natalenka, diminutive, you know, sweet. So it's as if I was talking about a third person, like Ivanko and his little Natalka. I was in love, I guess, in a fictive way. You know, I was in love with the idea of being in love with somebody in Ukraine, and also so safe because it's so far away.
What about him?
Was he really falling in love with me?
Yes.
Am I a cruel-hearted woman?
No, not at all.
No. Was he falling in love with me? No, he had a mission. He wanted to come. That's why I was hurt by the last letter, because he abruptly, out of nowhere, said, I met somebody else, and I'm not in love with you anymore. There you go, you know? And that was a code to say that they're not letting me out. And afterwards, we did exchange, you know, a couple of Christmas greetings or something like that, and it just petered out. It's sort of like saying, you know, we were in this Romeo and Juliet play, and the play ended. See you later. So, and somehow, you know, I mean it not so flippantly, but it always happened also between age 17 and age like 28. And in that age, you grow, you know, on hormones.
That's
Okay.
a fascinating.
So think back to everybody. I mean, what letters did you write at age 17?
I'm wondering about the books of practicalities. How did you make the editing? Did you publish all of the letters, or some of them were omitted, and why? And also, what was the role of Ivan in the project? So did you consult with him? Did you ask him something? What was his take on the whole project?
Okay, that's a big question. And I'll say first, this launch was billed as you know, Natalka Husar's letters, like letters book by Natalka Husar. It is all fiction. It's fake news, because as I said, I did not write this book nor these letters. This book was put together initially by, Lidiia Lykhach from Rodovid got excited by publishing this book. Natalia, when she saw these, she was equally excited and saw it from historical perspective. So they're not just, you know, beautiful letters that Natalka kept along with other letters that Natalka's kept. It's this political story. Both of them, but I know that Lidiia for sure read every single letter. I have not read those letters again and edited them. There was over 500. I think 300 or so were published. I think keeping the ones that were most visual to give a sense. I think that's how that was edited. But that's a huge job to actually form it into a book that has, as they say in Ukrainian, ruki i nohe, that has hands and feet. That is a story. And it was Natalia who put in that third character.
And if I can add very briefly, it was an amazing collaboration of such different people. I come from an academic domain. Natalka is an artist, and Lidiia is a publisher who publishes the art albums, and they're super successful and very big in Ukraine. I saw narratives, and I wanted to see the stories within the letters. Natalka and Lidiia were quite interested in preserving the artistic qualities of that. So we had many discussions how to do it together. And in the end, as you just pointed out, it defies any definition. It cannot be defined. If words are being defined. I think it's a plus. So decisions were made for various purposes in terms of editorial decisions, yeah.
I just wanted to add that Ivan did not have too much to do with this because initially when he was approached, he said there were a few letters. A few letters. He said, yeah, we corresponded. There were a few letters. 580 some few letters. He certainly agreed and he was excited by this, but it's a ghost from the past. We're talking 50 years. Since then he's been, happily married and successful.
I was asking him during my meetings with him what he would think about this book, and he was interested in that, but he didn't know what to make of it. But in the end, it worked out wonderfully because, of course, it also celebrates him as an artist. And because of his story, this book got an important angle, historically important story to be shared with so many audiences. And that is his contribution, and that made this book very powerful.
Maybe I missed this, but were you able to get the access to the KGB files on Ostafiichuk and see what it said about the relationship?
I have been asking the archives to locate the files, possible files. The search was conducted. The files on the name of Zatayonny, meaning in Russian, the one who is secretive, were simply destroyed during the purges when the KGBs were purging their own, destroying their own files in the late 80s. That was amongst those which were destroyed, which is unfortunate. But there's another story to that, and thank you for asking this question. It's unending. One of those colonels who was interrogating Ivan during these long, year-long meetings, at some point ran into him on the street, and Ivan was telling me that the colonel threatened that he could write a book about him because he has all the files. So that was already in independent Ukraine. So there might be another story somewhere out there, which is amazing.
But he was reluctant when you approached him with this project, and I think it was sort of like feeling like the KGB's after him. They want to publish it 50 years later, they want to publish these. I think not knowing you at all, like here's this researcher, I think he was very reluctant, but he warmed up.
I think we can actually bring our event to the closure, and probably a round of applause to Natalka and Natalia.